when you look at postmodernism, the creation of meaning from nothing is a really big idea. So when we look at the history of art, we ask the question of how we actually know things. And traditionally, art was always seen as a medium through which we see reality. The art was a way that we could come to a better understanding of reality. All the symbols and systems and machines and tools that we build for ourselves, we build in order to try to understand the world in a better way. The weird thing about postmodernism is that the medium itself becomes the reality. So here's my original diagram. So for most of Western history, art was the medium through which we see reality. So you can see on the right there's the apple, and on the left there's understanding, and in the middle is the medium or the lens through which we interpret, the apple. We come to a better understanding of it, and that's art, but that could be anything. But in postmodernism, the medium becomes the reality. The apple itself doesn't matter so much. It's you know it's what we do with it that becomes so important to us, and that's a really big deal for modern people. So to understand postmodernism, it's important to kind of look at a couple of really important concepts. One of them is the concept of how representation is more important than the thing being represented. That's a really important concept. Throughout the history of art, the thing being represented is really, really important. But in the postmodern era, the act of representation becomes almost everything. A few more concepts are like intertextuality, which sounds complicated, but it's basically the idea that art is a group effort. It's not just one person making it, and it's not. We're not looking at a genius that makes the art. We're looking at all the people together that create it. Another big concept in postmodernism is the concept of multiple perspectives, that we actually see the world from many, many, many different perspectives. It's not one perspective is the right one. Another concept is the concept of diversity being more important than like a single story, but like many, many, many stories. And also that truth is relative, which is pretty controversial. That the truth isn't just a single idea, but that a whole bunch of ideas about the thing is closer to the truth. And finally, this really weird word called pastiche, which I think, from what I can tell, just means like a collage or a mashup of things. So if you think of Pai's view of the world as really a mashup of other traditional views, that would be like pretty accurate. But the weird thing is that Pai himself, the boy, I think is really just supposed to be kind of like all of us, that we all kind of create a mashup of worldviews. And we don't really necessarily know like a single worldview. And when we look at our, the foundational idea of reality close up, we realize that there's all kinds of gaps in it, and it's really just a mashup of different views of reality. Okay, so that's an overview of some key concepts. Let's just get into the history of art itself. So one thing that you're going to see is that art kind of comes full circle. In the Stone Age, it was really primitive, but at the same time, there were a couple of really key ideas that I think people have come back to. One is that the world is magical. Now, what does magical mean? It really means power. Magic, the traditional idea of magic was that we could use it to control the world around us, and it's suggested that in the Stone Age, people used art to control their world. They actually, or they thought they could. They would make pictures of things and use them as almost like talismans to make those things come under their control. This could be seen not only in the cave paintings and in other kind of like talismans, but even in the concept of the name. The ancient concept of a name is that if you knew somebody's real name, you could control them. So art was magical. The other thing is that the universe was not only magical but personal. That the universe is filled with people. And it's personalized. So I don't know if that's really true today. I don't know if we use art to, personalize our universe, but we definitely, I think we definitely use our machinery to control the world and to make it, come under our dominion. Okay, so the Lithic period, which covered millions of years, was followed by the Bronze period and the Silver period, I guess, in the Western world. But I'm going to jump straight to the Classic period, which lasted, I guess, a lot around 1300 years, and it's essentially like ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And when you look at the art of this period, it's dominated by a couple of ideas, or the predominant thought of that period was what we would call essentialist. So, what is essentialism? Essentialism is the idea that everything has an essence, or everything has an underlying kind of um, I don't know, like formula. And if you understood the formula of that thing, you could control that thing. You could heal that thing and make it better. That was essentialism is one of the classic era's great gifts to to the human, you know, uh, to human thinking. This idea that everything sort of has a formula. Where did essentialism come from? We're not really sure, but it might have come to us from the ancient, distant past. Um, the idea of polytheism might have been, um, you know, the kind of the origin of that idea that the universe is ruled by many, many, many gods. And so if, there was a god for everything, right? Like a god of the stone or a god of the tree, then maybe that god was the essence of the tree. And this idea that the universe is inhabited by spirits, maybe the spirits came to be thought of as the essence of that thing. So, what is the how do you fix a car? Well, you have to understand the essence of the car, and maybe that car, that's the spirit of the car, the idea of the car engine or whatever. And there were two great classic thinkers of the period, although there were many others, but two huge ones. Plato introduced the idea of rationalism, which is that essences are known through just thinking, and Aristotle introduced the idea of empiricism, which is that essences are known through observation. So when we look at the art of the time, we can see that art kind of reflects this idea of essences. The art of the classic period shows people as being very perfectly people. It wasn't showing the flaws of people, but it was showing people at their best. They had perfect physiques, and they had serene, calm expressions, and they were sort of in the midst of doing things in their proper way. The music and the art and the drama of the time was also very very oriented towards form and perfection. It was symmetrical. It were harmonious. Art and literature had to follow certain rules, but the rules were, I think, a reflection of this idea of essentialism, that everything had kind of an essence. All right, so then we again come to the medieval period, about 800 years following the collapse of the Roman Empire, and of course, the Middle Ages. We don't think of the Middle Ages as being caused by a change in thought. We think of it as being just caused by the fall of this massive Roman Empire. Um, but the thought kind of followed that. The thought became, it was still essentialist, right? People in the Middle Ages still believed that everything had an essence to it. They still had this, they had monotheism instead of polytheism. So they believed instead of believing in many thousands of God, they believed in one God. But God essentially still, there was still a place where everything belonged, and there was still an essence to things. There was this belief that everything had an essence, but it was a subjective belief. They didn't really think that they could understand that belief through reason or empirical study. So they came to so there was this idea of faith, that reality could only be known through by in the afterlife. We couldn't really know the essence of things through any kind of study or effort on our part. That the life itself required a leap of faith, and life was really more of a test than an opportunity to understand the essence of things. So so it was a bit of a shift. It went from being more objectivist to being more subjectivist, and this idea came to be that your essence or your identity came from your role in a larger order. Like it was not your job to understand things, but really just to accept things. And that was where the faith came in. So your role in life could not really be fully understood. It couldn't be studied, right? You could only understand it. You couldn't understand it. You just had to accept it. And the church basically told everybody what their role was. So you had a role in the feudal order. You were the subject of a of a lord, and then you had a role in the metaphysical order. You had a place in the great chain of being. So art was kind of a reflection of this. Art was not really so much a reflection of the essential beauty of things, partly because the artists didn't have the time to make things beautiful, but also um, it was more because of this idea of the the need to follow, the need to kind of know your place and accept things on faith. So art was very much a teaching tool, whether you're talking about the courtly love poetry, which taught people to, to have a platonic relationship with members of the opposite sex, or to basically not to have romantic sexual love, but to really just, you know, um, appreciate people, like love them in a brotherly sense, as probably the Bible would encourage. Also, love. Also, the histories of the time, the chronicles, were not really scientific histories of things. It wasn't really about teaching us what actually happened. They were more like lessons of history. Like, so Richard III, for example, would be more like a kind of a lesson of how not to be a king, rather than a lesson, rather than a study of what actually happened. And epic adventures were really the story of how to be a good hero and how to be a good servant of God, rather than, rather than what actually happened. So, okay, then we move on to the Renaissance, which um, was probably caused by economic improvements in Western Europe, and slowly the Europeans had more and more peace and political kind of stability, so they could gather lots and lots of wealth and do stuff with that. I'm not an expert in any of this, but I imagine the economists would say the Renaissance was caused by, you know, like long periods of peace and prosperity, and they had more, and then some important discoveries too, that came about through various political changes and stuff. But the ideas of the Renaissance shifted from being subjective to objective. So, like the classic era, the people in the Renaissance had more confidence that they could know things. So there was this sense that you could find out how to be happy in your life, and you could also understand the truth of the universe. So one of the great sayings of the time was, "Man is the measure of all things," and that's a real change from the past. That's a real change from the medieval period, which was much more focused on faith. The meta narrative was one of faith in the great chain of being. Here in the Renaissance, the meta narrative was that humanism was possible, or humanism, that man is the measure of all things. So art changed to reflect this idea. Um, Art, I would say, became kind of like a metaphorical statement of essentialism. So the art of the Renaissance became, they really incorporated a lot of pagan and Christian symbolism, um, not because they believed in the ancient Greek and Roman stories, but because they saw them as very beautiful stories in and of themselves, and in great metaphors for the great themes of life. And also they, because of um, the wealth of the Renaissance, they had a lot more time, and they had a lot more time to practice the renewed skills that they picked up from the classic era. They had a lot more free time to train generations of artists, like in the the Academy of Florence and other places like that. So the art really saw like the skill level just exploded, went through the roof. People suddenly learned, or they were relearning how to do proper sculpture, and they had more money for paint, and so they started had to do, they learned how to do great beautiful paintings and stuff. Um, Okay, so then this was followed by the Baroque period, which was kind of a reaction. The Baroque period, like any other period of history, is actually driven by the economics and politics of the time. And if you study this period in history, you'll learn that around the early 1500s, at the kind of the end of the Renaissance in Europe, there were challenges to the Catholic monopoly on the truth. The monopoly on the truth of the Catholic Church was kind of challenged by people like Martin Luther, and so. And then there were all these wars that were fought. There was like something called the Wars of Religions in the 1500s, and then there was something called the 30 Years' War in the 1600s. And these were challenges to the kind of the order of the time. The Catholic Church, was being challenged as kind of the the one answer to all questions, and the Holy Roman Empire was being challenged as the one political order. So the Baroque period was kind of a reaction to that. What it was a shift back to kind of medieval subjective attitude. So there was still this belief in essentialism, but there was this kind of sense that we can't really know the truth, that truth depends on faith and not on reason. In the Baroque period, there was an increasing emphasis on the mystery of life, so that life was seen, and the universe was seen, as fundamentally mysterious rather than problematic. And this kind of idea of the the idea that you can't really um, grasp the essence of life, that life was essential. The existence was essential, but it was not really solvable. And so a lot of the so there's this new idea, this kind of fractal idea, that the more you know, the more you realize that you need to know. So I'm going to talk about fractals a little bit later on, but it's kind of like a pattern that is infinitely detailed. That when you get close up to it, it's still detailed. That there's no kind of point at which you fully understand what you're looking at, and that's kind of based. I think that's sort of a symbol of this idea that life is really mysterious. So, what about the art of the time? Well, the word Baroque comes from the Portuguese barroco, which means a misshapen pearl. So that's a good way to think about the art of this period. It was beautiful, but also kind of weird, like warped. It combined precise style, like beautiful style, with weird subject matter, like violent subject matter. All of the stories of the Bible that were really violent and messed up, that was the subject of Baroque, art. And any weird stories from mythology, they really played that up. And so some of the art qualities of the time were like movement. It was the art, the pictures were filled with movement. They were asymmetrical. The events, the scenery was kind of grotesque. There's lots of scenes of like genocide and patricide and regicide, and people doing really messed up things and suffering terrible death. It was also, the subject matter was very bold and fantastic. But the art was beautiful in a really kind of twisted way. This was followed by the neoclassical period, or the Enlightenment, which was from about 1680 to 1780. And the Enlightenment was a time that was really important to science. There was a huge wave of scientific discovery in all kinds of areas. And Francis Bacon created the scientific method. And there are all these scientists jumping up and popping up everywhere. And this was what I would call a period of great as objective essentialism, where they truly believed that everything had an essence, and they believed that they could know it by study, by they could apply their minds to understanding the essence of things. So nature itself came under the microscope, even though there weren't, I don't maybe there weren't very many microscopes at the time, but nature came to be studied, and people were fascinated by nature. Nature was believed to be governed by reasonable laws. Species came to be thought of in those days, and you know, your this was kind of like a variation on the great chain of being, but it was like you could really understand yourself because you were a member of a species. Also, the this new concept called deism came about, which was like this idea that the universe was created by God, who then was no longer necessary, but God created the universe to function beautifully according to these laws that everybody could understand. It didn't mean that people didn't believe in God. It just meant that, the best way to really uh, like honor God would be to fully study the universe that God had created. And so all of these, this confidence was applied to other areas of life, like, for example, human virtue. What was the best way to live? And it was understood that the essence of being a human was to be a thinker. The best sort of person was somebody who used their mind and applied their common sense. So you could mess up, right? You could be imperfect. You could live poorly, but when you applied your reason to life, you became happy. And so emotions became were thought of as a very dangerous thing. And so the key to life was to kind of suppress your emotions and apply your intellect to achieve a greater understanding of life, to live a better life. So it wasn't how long you did things or how much experience you had, but how much reason you could apply to life. This also was applied to economics, and so another great concept that emerged at this time was liberalism. Okay, so getting on to the other side of the page, what about art? Well, the art was kind of the art of the Enlightenment period. Kind of was a bit opposite to the Baroque period. It was the emphasis was on simplicity, on wit, and humor, or just intelligence. There was an emphasis on restraint and discipline rather than extravagance and boldness. Also, the artist was focusing on being as clear as possible, and focusing on design, on using using the rules of art to create fresh, clear designs rather than art that would shock and like outrage or amaze people. And the subject matter of the neoclassical period was scenes that reflected calm and self composure, and the people that were in these paintings and in these sculptures, and were always shown in a very calm, orderly, self-composed way. They were the most, the calm, successful, powerfully calm person was seen as the someone to put in a painting, or scenery of nature that showed nature all in its orderly perfection, everything where it should be. Okay, so this was followed by the Romantic period of starting around the 1780s, and the Romantic period was an even more like violent reaction to the Enlightenment, as the Enlightenment than the Enlightenment was to the Baroque period. So, what about the Romantic period? What kind of thinking happened at this time? This was a very subjectivist period. Um, there was so much emphasis on the powers of emotion that I don't even know whether the people in this time thought of essences at all. But it was a time of great of confidence in feelings and emotions. It was also a time of revolutionary politics. So you guys might have heard of the French Revolution. Well, this was when it happened in at the end of like the 1700s. So the idea behind revolutionary politics was of, well, now we understand from the Enlightenment how things ought to be. We can look at politics and apply our reason to understand how the world should be. What are we waiting for? We know how to create a political system now using our minds. Let's rebuild the world's political systems according to reason. And the best way to do that is just through violent action, right? We're going to they looked at the French, like intellectuals looked at the king and said, "What are you doing here? We don't need you." So they got rid of the king. They cut his head off. and they had a big revolution. So the romantic thinking of the time was that emotion was more important than logic, imagination was more important than science, and creativity was more important than planning. Nature itself was seen as super cool and interesting, but it was seen in a very different way than the Enlightenment. So nature was not you know was not species, and it wasn't like the things that were universal and permanent. Rather, nature was seen as the untamed and the wild things. It was indefinable and exotic, unfamiliar and unconfined. Nature was always messing things up, and hurricanes and tsunamis and plagues, things that people couldn't understand and couldn't control. That's what the romantic thinkers were fascinated with. How no matter how we tried, we ultimately could not explain things. But reality was fundamentally mysterious and unexplainable. And the same thing could be said about human nature, that human beings were fundamentally unexplainable, but they had this, godlike potential that was both horrifying and glorious and spectacular. So the real key um, to living was not understanding but experience. You should not try to understand your godlike potential, but just experience it. Tap into it and just let it go. Like trust your instincts. So the art of the time, it reflected this. The the art was kind of wild and intense. The artist was still a person with great skill. The painters and the poets of the time, they wrote with great artistic skill, but they really let their feelings kind of take over. And so the paintings were kind of wild. They had like energy, and they emphasized the sources of art were the kind of the dark side of life, the dark side of experience, the dark side of emotions, horror, terror, awe. This is the beginning of the horror story, the beginning of Gothic fiction, and some truly disturbing, paintings and sculptures. And the artist himself was seen as some kind of like god, who received inspiration just just and tapped into somehow this godlike energy, and they translated it into the art. The artist was seen as this like really mysterious, wild, kind of crazy person, like a rock star from the 1970s. And it's not like artists did drugs all the time, but there were a number of really famous works of art that were inspired by drug use, like Coleridge's in Kubla Khan, right? Okay, so after this period, the Romantic period, then there is a powerful reaction against this whole idea of emotion, and this was the period of realism from 1850 roughly to 1881. So the period of realism in Western history was a period that I would call essential objectivism. So it was this belief, the true belief in the essence of things, and that we could understand those essences. So the period of realism was like kind of like the Enlightenment, but even more so. There was enormous confidence in the ability to understand things through the application of reason. So there were a number of really important ideas. One was positivism, which was that we could understand the truth just by observation. And the other was this idea of material determinism, or that we could understand the world just by the world was material. There was no such thing as the spiritual at all. Some other really important meta narratives of the time was the idea of Marxism, that human justice or equality could be achieved in the material world. Karl Marx came along and he basically said that human history was all about working towards greater equality, and that ultimately everybody would have the same amount of wealth. He also talked about how we would probably have a violent revolution to achieve this, but this was Marxism. Also, was this other idea called social Darwinism, which is that if evolution was true, and if life on Earth was based on the struggle for survival, then human civilizations were probably governed by the same thing. And we should probably just let civilizations fight each other, and whoever wound up on top, that would be really good for human beings, because that would be the highest, most powerful civilization is the highest expression of human evolution. So this is not necessarily a very nice idea. It had a potential for terrible violence, which happened like around the end of the century, just like the Marxist revolutions took off in the early 20th century. And also, there's this idea of feminism, which is that um, feminism is this idea that the world had been governed by men, by this patriarchal system for thousands of years, and it would be better for the world if women achieved equality with men. So that took off in the period of realism. But what about the art of the time? The art of the realist period was very realistic. It was the the goal of art was to faithfully reproduce the world as we could see it, as faithfully as possible, not at all embellished by any kind of idea of how the world should look, but supposedly how the world actually was. And art was seen as something very important. It actually had a really powerful purpose, which was to teach people the way the world actually was, so that we would have a better chance of actually fixing the world. So this was not coincidentally the first time photography was used, and so the photograph was seen as like um, the ultimate kind of symbol of the realistic period. And a lot of paintings of this time were almost like photographs. They looked the artist basically just tried to use his or her skill to kind of reproduce exactly the world exactly the way we would see it. The purpose of a novel was to teach people about the human mind and how humans were a product of their environment, and how the best way to make people happier was to change the environment. And so, yeah, art was essentially kind of didactic, kind of like the way it was in the Middle Ages. Art was seen as a way to try to teach people how the world was so that we could fix it. So ordinary topics became really popular in this time, unlike the Romantic period where extraordinary topics were important. So just the poverty and hard work of ordinary people. Evil was seen as something that was not terrifying or mysterious, but as a problem that was actually very ordinary and could be solved. Um, and anyway, so that's the realist period. This was followed by the period of modernism, which I would say lasted from like 1870 to 1940, just before World War II. And modernism is like a really weird period because it just led to this explosion of lots of different forms of art. But what was the thinking of the modernist period over on the left side of the screen? Well, I would call it subjectivist in the sense that the thinkers started to decide, they came to this conclusion that we couldn't really know the truth. Just like in the Baroque period or the Romantic period or the medieval period, there was this kind of subjective attitude, but it was much more pessimistic. I would say that the idea was, I think, that we couldn't even experiencing the truth and understanding the truth was really, really difficult. There was this great period of kind of pessimism, and I would also say that this is the first time when we come up with this idea of existentialism. Existentialism is the opposite of essentialism. Essentialism, we've seen for thousands of years, was this idea that everything has an essence. Existentialism is this idea that we don't know if everything has an essence. And that was kind of like this whole subjective idea. We don't even know what the essence of life is anymore. We don't know if there is a single idea of of how people should live. So there wasn't really this confidence um, that had been enjoyed for thousands of years. For the first time in Western history, thinkers were not really confident about whether life had an essence or whether the universe had an essence. So there was still the practice of science. Definitely scientific discoveries were being made, but the whole idea that science could really show us reality was disappearing. So some of the other ideas of the time were the idea of the subconscious, and Freud and Jung kind of explained this theory that civilization, for Freud, civilization was based on this ancient trauma that was buried in the collective subconscious, and that personality for many people was based on this ancient childhood trauma that was really buried in the personal subconscious. So the idea of the subconscious really became popular starting from this time. Also, Jung had this idea of the subconscious, but he said that it wasn't an ancient trauma, but ancient wisdom that was buried in the subconscious. That if you really tapped into your subconscious, you could learn very, very powerful and beautiful lessons from your ancestors. So these two guys really, they differed widely on, what we could learn from the subconscious, but they shared this belief in the subconscious, and that was kind of a new thing. Some other really powerful meta narratives of the time was the idea that government was bad, and this was anarchism. So anarchism started popping up in the late 19th century. Total distrust of any government, and this resulted in a lot of assassinations. So you guys might have heard about the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, which started the First World War. Well, that was part of a trend. There were always, all these kind of terror groups were attacking like kings and presidents. A number of presidents were killed around this time, including Abraham Lincoln, who I guess was killed around like in the 1860s. But lots and lots of other world leaders were killed. Another really big meta narrative was the meta narrative of fascism, which hopefully we're all quite nervous about. Fascism is a really dangerous idea, but this idea that the nation itself was more important than the individual. So fascism challenged the Enlightenment concept of the importance of the individual. For the fascists, the nation was more important than the individual, and nation was defined by race. So what was the nation of Germany? It was the German people. What was the nation of Japan? It was the Japanese people, and that the race of was more important than the individual, and the government had to be given power to purify the race. So this is a terrifying idea that had like really horrible consequences in the 20th century, and it put itself up and against the Marxist idea of the revolution of the workers. Anyway, okay, that's a whole other thing. But the art of the time was really all over the place. There were many different movements. There was the decadent movement, and then there was the impressionist movement and the imagist movement. There was expressionism and surrealism and all kinds of things, the data movement. But they all seem to be based on this one idea, which I think is this kind of sad, pessimistic idea that we can't know the truth. For the first time in thousands of years, the artists all came to this collectively sad conclusion. We can't know what's real. We can't really know what's real. So there are all these different directions that art went in. They went in the direction of sensuousness, art for its own sake, or symbolism or idealism, or the subjectivism of the impressionist movement. And all these things like the anti-artistic, direction of the dada movement, or even the nostalgia and idealism of the pre-Raphaelite or the Southern agrarian movement. Whatever it was just this idea that we can't really know the truth. The truth is just too big for us. We can't really know it anymore. And that's the modern period. And then we move finally into the period of postmodernism, which is this idea that has been with us for like the past 50, 60 years, which is that, well, I kind of explained that given that we can't really know the truth, there was this kind of shift over to this idea that art is the reality, that we can't really know the truth, but that we can create the truth, that we can make the truth like out of nothing almost. And so the new postmodern idea is a really bold idea, which suggests that people create reality, or in a way, people are gods, which is really kind of freaky and would have been terrifying for anybody in the Middle Ages or anybody, in any period of time up until, I don't know, I guess like the modernist period. The period we're living in, the postmodern period, is actually a period of great kind of weird confidence. So like I said before, representation became important, more important than the reality it was purporting to represent. It's the symbol that matters more than the thing that is being symbolized. Intertextuality rather than genius. So people together create the art, and that the many perspectives more important than a single perspective. Diversity being more important than a single foundation story. Subjectivism being more important than objectivism. We can't really know the truth, but we can create the truth. We can create it as a kind of collaborative effort. playfulness rather than focus, irony rather than spontaneity, and pastiche rather than originality. So this is kind of the direction. This is kind of where we're at right now in a lot of kind of thinking. So so even though the modern person sort of sees themselves as in many different ways, if you actually look at the way art is today, the way it's treated, the kind of role it plays in our lives, the way advertising kind of dominates the the mental landscape of our time, and the way computers and the internet are changing our lives, the postmodernists have a lot to say about that. So there's many different kinds of art, but so there's like all these different art movements in the kind of postmodern period. There's post-colonialism and the Brat Pack era and the magical realist movement and the beat poetry and confessionalism and the Black Mountain poets and the theater of the absurd and abstract expressionism and the Aleppo movement of art and of poetry and all that. But really, if you look at it, all of these art movements are kind of based on this idea that art itself is the reality, that art is becoming, or that the world is increasingly shaped by the art that we create. So this is the postmodern period. So what does it have to do with pi? Just going back to my original slide, that the life of pi is about a boy who creates his own world. He creates his own religion, he creates his own world, he creates his own friendships, and he creates his own meaning. And that's how pi is kind of postmodern. So, okay, thank you.